In April 1959, a quiet residential street in the Cathays area of Cardiff was shook when 6-year-old Carol Ann Stevens disappeared. With witnesses claiming to have seen Carol get into a car with an unknown man, the police searched desperately to find the little girl. 2 questions remained. Who was driving the vehicle, and where was Carol now? Thank you so much for joining me for today's true crime episode. My name is Gemma. Welcome to the Still of the Night. Carol Ann Stevens lived at 9 Malaphant Street in the Cathays area of Cardiff, Wales, with her 25-year-old mum Mavis and her stepdad Ken. Her parents had divorced a few years earlier and her biological dad lived in London at the time. Carol was described as a happy, chatty and friendly little girl. One witness called her a chatterbox in their statement to police. She was known to play outside with friends in the street around her house often. This was incredibly commonplace for kids as young as that to play outside in their area and at that time period. The neighbours knew each other and everyone kept an eye out for all the kids. Tuesday, April 7th, 1959 had started as any other day for little Carol. In the morning, Mavis, Carol's mum, had asked Carol to run some errands for her at the local corner shop, Wilkins. So off Carol went, buying the things her mum needed and some sweets for herself. After, Carol returned home safely and announced that she was going to play outside. Mavis described that Carol seemed eager, more so than normal, to get back outside, but at the time she just assumed she was excited to go and play with her friends. She could never have imagined that it would be the last time that she would see her daughter alive. Carol was seen playing with other local kids on nearby Roberts Street, but as the hours passed, Carol didn't return home. Mavis began asking around to see if anyone had seen her, and it quickly became apparent that something was horribly wrong, and so they called the police. According to witnesses, Carol was last seen knocking on the passenger window of a car parked on Fair Oak Road, just the next road over from Malaphant Street. The dark-coloured car was parked up outside the cemetery. One woman claimed to have seen Carol get into a Morris Minor that she thought was dark green but couldn't be 100% sure. Another witness, a 6-year-old boy who'd been playing with Carol and a few other local kids, had said that he had actually approached the car with Carol. The man driving had chatted to the kids and then opened his passenger door and gestured for them to get inside. The little boy declined, but Carol got in. What was curious was Carol appeared to already know this man. When police started going door to door, things got even stranger. Because according to some of the local kids, Carol had recently been talking about a new uncle, but hadn't mentioned a name. Another witness claimed to have seen Carol in an unknown car several times before she disappeared. Now, what was odd about this was that Carol would be dropped off in a nearby street and never at her house. Someone else also said that a few days earlier they had seen a man peering into the backyard of Carol's house. But who was this mystery man? Well, some thought it could have been Carol's biological dad secretly visiting his daughter, and maybe he was the one who took her. So, of course, the police went to speak with him, and after being investigated, his alibi ruled him firmly out, and, according to him, the first he knew his daughter was missing was in the news. An interesting lead, though, came from the local shopkeeper, Mr. Wilkins. Remember, Carol had been into his shop that morning. He said Carol would normally stay in his shop to chat a while, but that morning she didn't. He also claimed she appeared more excited than usual, and if you remember, Mavis had said something similar about Carol being in a rush to leave and being more excited. Had Carol arranged to meet the man who had apparently been driving around in his car? And what we have to remember about this time period is that not everyone had a car. In fact, many people in this area didn't, so it would have been really impressive, especially to young, excitable kids, to see a car, even more so to get the chance to go for a ride. But that's not all Mr. Wilkins said. He had also had a conversation with a man in his shop earlier in the morning. The man had made a comment about picking up a girl, which Mr. Wilkins thought was odd. He described the man as around 35 to 40 years old and about 5'9", dark-haired, clean-shaven. He described him as possibly being a commercial traveller, essentially what we would know now as a sales representative that would travel around a set area. So police set about finding the identity of the mystery man. As time passed, there was still no sign of Carol. Police had been stopping and checking vehicles that matched the description given by the witnesses and had also been watching the local port in case whoever had taken Carol tried to get her out of the country. Now, they literally stopped and checked thousands of vehicles and even enlisted the help of the Met Police. Residents were asked to check garden sheds and farmers were told to search their outbuildings. At one point, there was even talk of draining Roath Park Lake, which was nearby, as part of the search. Exactly 2 weeks later, on the 21st of April 1959, a surveyor was working in a narrow river culvert near the remote village of Horeb, and I apologise to any Welsh speakers if I've said that incorrectly, which is some 60 miles west of Cardiff and just north of Llanelli. And there he made a gruesome discovery. Little Carol's body had been dumped in the water. Her autopsy revealed she had been suffocated. One of her little brown shoes was about 5 feet away from her body, and the other was found further downstream. It seemed as if whoever had killed Carol had put her body into the opening of the culvert, and she had gone down it and a little way down the stream. But this specific location was so remote. Just a few houses in the village and a pub. And one thing is for sure, where the opening of the culvert is could only have been known by someone with local knowledge. One of the documentaries that I watched when I was researching this case went to the actual scene where Carol's body was found. So let me just take a second to describe it to you so you can get an idea. This was down a really remote country road. And to access the culvert, you had to go through like an entrance to a field. In any countryside field, the entrance normally has a gate, and there's normally like a small lay-by or a small pull-in area that is enough for a car. So what the police believed was the killer had pulled in here. He would have had to have gone through some trees and some hedges, and then he would be at the opening of the culvert. So access to it was incredibly easy, but because of the hedges and the trees, it's well hidden. So unless you lived around there or you'd worked around there, there's no way from just driving past it you could have possibly known that there was this culvert there. So once you get to the opening of the culvert, there is a drop, about 45-degree angle that goes down, and then it carries on into the stream below. Now, if you stand in the stream below, the embankments are really quite steep. So the difference in level from the road to the bottom stream is really quite high. So it would be really unlikely that anybody would spot anything down there. And again, there's hedges and overgrowth all the way there. So whoever had put Carol there was obviously hoping that she either wouldn't be found or it would be a really long time until she was. So the police, thinking the perpetrator had local knowledge, did the obvious. They started interviewing local people. And this wasn't a difficult task because, like I say, this village was literally a few houses and a pub. But frustratingly for the police, no one stood out as an obvious suspect. But someone else was about to become a real person of interest. The police had been working hard to find the identity of the commercial traveller that Mr. Wilkins, the shopkeeper, had mentioned to them. This man turned out to be Ronald Edward Murray. Ronald worked at Carson's Confectionery, selling and distributing sweets to Cardiff and West Wales. He also drove a dark Morris Minor. But here's the kicker. Ronald had previously worked at the brickworks in the small village where Carol's body was discovered. In fact, he'd worked about 300 yards from the opening of the culvert. Now, if this guy is not just a perfect illustration of what you'd think of as, like a child snatching villain in an old-fashioned movie, I don't know what is. The guy travels around. He has local knowledge of where she was found for a start. But he travels around in his car, meaning he gets to go quite anonymously from place to place. And he's got a boot full of sweets. Like, I'm pretty sure we were all told as kids, don't get into cars with strangers if they offer sweets. And this guy's driving around with a whole boot full. So, of course, once the police find out who this guy is, and, there's nothing there that I've just said about him that would you would consider solid evidence or enough to arrest him, but it's definitely enough to give him a side eye. So police headed straight to Ronald's house, where he was initially interviewed by Superintendent Davies. The police told him that they were investigating Carol's murder, to which he replied, "You don't think I had anything to do with it, do you?" Which feels a little bit defensive. If you knew that you were in the area innocently trying to sell sweets to shopkeepers in the area that a little girl has gone missing, would it shock you if police came knocking at your door? Would you assume that they were there because you were a witness rather than a suspect? But this guy he's sketchy. When they asked to take his car, he immediately handed over the keys, stating it was a company vehicle, and denied any involvement. But during his interview, Ronald initially denied being at work on the 7th of April, claiming he had been sick. However, he later admitted that he had gone to work that day and that he had been in Cardiff. He also admitted to parking up on Roberts Street, remember the street that the children had been playing on before Carol went missing. He said after he'd been to work, he drove home, arriving at around 12:15 to 12:30 p.m. and spent the afternoon alone until his son came home from school at around 3:45 p.m. So he had a time frame of about 3.5 hours that couldn't be verified. Interestingly, the pathologist determined that Carol's time of death was between 12:15 and 2:45 p.m. based on the contents of her stomach. Now, this would line up perfectly with the time that Ronald claimed to be home alone. However, the autopsy also claimed that Carol had been dead for 1 week when she was found, but we know it had been 2 weeks since she'd been missing, which has confused the timeline. Carol was found wearing the same clothing that she'd been wearing the day she went missing: a grey skirt, cardigan, new brown shoes, and she had her glasses. Even though Ronald looked like a promising suspect and a pretty sketchy dude, the police never charged him due to lack of evidence. Hundreds of people attended Carol's funeral as she was laid to rest in Cathays Cemetery on the 27th of April. The impact this had on the local community was huge, where parents before would let their children play outside, they could walk to and from school by themselves. The school was literally at the end of the road that Carol lived in. Parents were no longer allowing their children to do that. They were accompanying them everywhere because everyone was so fearful that the murderer could still be lurking around, just waiting to take another child. After all of this, Carol's case went cold. In 2019, Detective Chief Inspector Mark Lewis, who works in the Major Crime Review team at South Wales Police, was tasked with reinvestigating Carol's murder 60 years after she'd died. He said, quote, "There was a lot of trust in those days. Children played in the street and people left their doors open. For a child to be snatched off the street was a shock in Cardiff, but it was a huge shock for people living in Horeb as well. This was a sleepy village where people just got on with their lives quite peacefully. For a 6-year-old child to be taken, murdered, and then dumped in the middle of nowhere, that leaves a lasting legacy. So it would be fantastic if we could provide answers for those communities," end quote. He then went on to say, quote, "At that time, for crime scene investigators, DNA and to a certain extent blood evidence wasn't really something that was being dealt with. If that crime scene had been worked today, things would have been different. Recovery of the original case files and exhibits has proved difficult as well. But we've had successes with historic cases in the past, as have other forces, so we don't give up hope," end quote. So with the evidence that had been collected and stored, items were sent for modern forensic examinations. Sadly, nothing conclusive was found. However, the forensic scientists that carried out the testing are hopeful that in the future, improved forensic testing will be sensitive enough to solve this case. And so today, Carol's murder remains unsolved. Sadly, Carol's mother, Mavis, passed away in 2002, never knowing who killed her little girl. This case is so incredibly sad. The idea of a trusting, happy little girl who thought that, this man, this new uncle, was able to build a rapport with her, so much so that she trusted him enough. Why wouldn't she get in his car if it was the same guy who had been seen driving her around previously? Why would she think there's any danger? She was 6 years old. We're over 60 years on now. Her family never got any closure. Carol never got any justice. It's just heartbreaking. I would love to know what your thoughts are on this case. What do you think of Ronald as a suspect? Maybe it was someone completely different. Maybe it was someone from the local neighborhood. Maybe it was someone else just passing through. Maybe it was someone connected to her family, and that's why she used the term new uncle, because she believed this person was her uncle. Either way, let me know what you think. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me for this episode. And until next time, friends, stay safe.